You're listening to Ideology. Support our work on Patreon and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. From around 1828 to 1852, the United States experienced what's known as the second party system, taking over after the first party system came to an end. This era was marked by a spike in political engagement, with more people than ever turning out to vote, joining rallies, subscribing to partisan newspapers, and showing a deep commitment to their chosen parties. During this period, two main parties were at the forefront of American politics: the Democrats, under the leadership of Andrew Jackson, and the Whigs, who were brought together by Henry Clay from the National Republicans and other critics of Jackson. There were also a few smaller parties springing up, like the Anti-Masonic Party, which was particularly influential between 1827 and 1834, the Liberty Party, which focused on abolition in 1840, and the Free Soil Party in 1848 and 1852, which opposed the expansion of slavery. The second party system wasn't just a feature of its time. It profoundly influenced the political, social, economic, and cultural dynamics of the so-called Jacksonian era. It paved the way for what would eventually become the third-party system. An interesting point to note, as highlighted by Frank Towers, is the major ideological rift between the two dominant parties. The Democrats were big on the idea of the sovereignty of the people, showing this through public demonstrations, constitutional conventions, and a strong belief in majority rule as the best way to govern. On the other hand, the Whigs were more focused on sticking to the rule of law, preferring written and immutable constitutions, and ensuring protections were in place to prevent the majority from imposing its will on the minority. Historian Richard P. McCormick has played a key role in clarifying what we understand about the term he focused on. He has shared the following insights. He describes it as a unique system of political parties. This system didn't just appear overnight. It took about 15 years to form, and it happened differently in different states. Its creation was driven by political leaders who were eager to win the presidency, which led them to build their own national alliances. Regional influences played a significant role. For instance, the supporters of Adams were mainly found in New England, while those supporting Jackson were in the Southwest. It was a groundbreaking time when the two-party system spread to the South and West, areas previously dominated by one-party politics. Remarkably, in each region, the two parties had roughly equal strength, making this the first and only time we've seen such a balance. This balance, however, made the system susceptible to issues that were specific to certain regions, like slavery. Across every state, these same two parties would compete not just for the electoral vote, but also for state-level offices. A turning point was between 1832 and 1834, when the South dramatically shifted to a two-party system, largely in response to issues with Van Buren. The Anti-Masonic Party found success only in places where there was a lack of a strong opposition party. While there were variations across the board, the political convention started to take the place of the caucus everywhere. The parties themselves had objectives, primarily focused on the ambitions of those seeking political office within them. This system also introduced a new style of campaigning that engaged the public more directly. It was the close races that drove voter turnout, not necessarily the charm of the candidates or the pressing issues of the day. Finally, the leaders who formed these parties did so in a way that reflected their own visions and characteristics. Some well-known figures in the Democratic camp included Andrew Jackson, Martin Van Buren, John C. Calhoun, James K. Polk, Lewis Cass, and Stephen Douglas. Over on the Whig side, standout names were John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, William H. Seward, and Thurlow Weed. Historian Robert Rimini sheds light on Martin Van Buren's impact on political progress in the U.S., crediting him with significant achievements that helped him clinch the presidency. Van Buren took charge of the New York Republican Party and established the Albany Regency, a smart group of men who ran the state while he worked on his career in Washington. This setup, one of the first of its kind, was noted for its adept use of patronage, the legislative caucus, and an official party newspaper to maintain control. In Washington, Van Buren set about restructuring the Republican Party by fostering an alliance between Southern planters and the so-called Plain Republicans of the North. Before Van Buren's time, political parties were often seen as necessary evils. However, he championed the idea that a party-based system was the most effective and democratic way to manage national affairs, an idea that eventually gained widespread acceptance across the country. In the presidential election of 1824, we saw something unique. There were no political parties, and the race came down to 4 candidates: Henry Clay, William Crawford, Andrew Jackson, and John Quincy Adams. All these men were technically from the same political group, the Democratic Republicans, but they each had their own regional support from various state factions. Because no one won a majority in the Electoral College, the decision went to the House of Representatives to pick the president. Henry Clay, who didn't make it to the top 3, played a crucial role as the Speaker of the House in negotiating the outcome. Andrew Jackson, even though he had the most popular and electoral votes, didn't win. Instead, John Quincy Adams, the son of the former President John Adams, was chosen. Right after becoming president, Adams appointed Clay as his Secretary of State. This move was loudly criticized by Jackson, who called it a corrupt bargain. Jackson was determined to fight what he saw as corruption in Washington. He worked hard, rallying support from local militias and political groups, eventually leading to the formation of what would become the Democratic Party. This new coalition helped him oust Adams in the next election in 1828. Martin Van Buren was a key figure in this effort, securing the support of Virginia and Pennsylvania, which led to his later roles as Secretary of State and Vice President under Jackson. The supporters of Adams and Clay eventually became known as the National Republicans, though Adams himself never quite aligned fully with this party. The historian Norton explained that Jackson's win in 1828 was seen as the people's will finally taking precedence, marking the rise of the country's first well-organized national party, the Democrats, characterized by their tight organization, which became a key feature of American politics in the 19th century. The Democrats, despite diverse opinions, shared a devotion to Jefferson's vision of an agrarian society, viewing big government as a threat to individual freedom. The 1824 election, with its corrupt bargain, only deepened their distrust of Washington politics. Jackson and his followers were wary of economic and political concentration. Believing it led to monopolies that favored the wealthy, they aimed to empower ordinary individuals by scaling back federal support for banks and corporations, and were skeptical of paper money. Jackson's tenure saw an increase in the use of presidential vetoes, and he and his supporters were generally against reforms, including educational reforms and the establishment of public schools, which they felt could restrict personal freedom and religious liberty. Historical analysis also shows how the second party stake emerged from local levels first, with New Jersey as a focal example. The state witnessed the same dramatic political shifts as the country, driven by the market revolution, a period of industrial growth and transportation improvement. Politicians like William N. Jeffers from New Jersey leveraged their support for Jacksonian policies to build their own political and financial success, showing how deeply intertwined politics and the economy had become. Andrew Jackson saw himself as a reformer, deeply anchored in the traditional values of republicanism, and fiercely against any move that he believed was favoritism toward specific interests. While Jackson did not participate in duels during his presidency, he was known for having physically confronted his political adversaries before, showing the same determination to defeat his opponents in the political arena. His resolve to dismantle the Second Bank of the United States was a key reason for the emergence of what is known as the Second Party System. The Second Bank, located in Philadelphia and having branches in major cities, functioned somewhat like today's Federal Reserve. Its control, particularly by Nicholas Biddle, irritated local bankers and politicians. Jackson had a strong distaste for banks, especially the paper currency they issued, believing firmly that only gold and silver or specie should be in circulation. After fierce struggles with Henry Clay, his main rival, Jackson managed to shut down Biddle's bank. Continuing his campaign against the banking system, Jackson issued the Specie Circular in July 1836, which banned the use of bank-issued paper money for purchasing federal land, demanding instead gold and silver coins. This move drove most businessmen and bankers toward the Whig Party, making the commercial and industrial cities Whig strongholds, while Jackson became even more esteemed among subsistence farmers and day laborers who were wary of bankers and finance. When it comes to the financial and economic turbulence of the Jacksonian era, economic historians have delved into its causes and effects. A majority align with Peter Teman's findings, concluding that Jackson's policies were not to blame. Instead, international circumstances out of America's reach, such as situations in Mexico, China, and Britain, were identified as the true sources of the economic instability of the 1830s. A 1995 survey of economic historians showed broad agreement with Temin's view that the inflation and financial crisis of that era stemmed from factors largely outside of President Jackson's control, indicating that these economic troubles would have occurred regardless of his actions against the Second Bank of the U.S. When Andrew Jackson became president, he implemented significant alterations to the distribution of government jobs, employing what was frequently referred to as the spoils system. Rather than solely compensating those who had previously supported him, Jackson also extended job offers to local and state politicians who were inclined to support him in the future. According to the historian Sirott, Jackson pioneered the concept of rotating individuals in government positions, viewing it as a fundamental aspect of Republican values. He believed that routinely altering the occupants of these positions could prevent corruption within the civil service. Nonetheless, the principal motivation behind these alterations was not solely to curb corruption, but also to fortify Jackson's political party by appointing devoted followers to these positions. This method of recruitment was not initiated by Jackson. It can actually be traced back to Thomas Jefferson, who eliminated officials from the Federalist Party upon assuming office. Furthermore, it should be noted that Jackson did not completely revamp the entire civil service. By the conclusion of his tenure, he had only removed fewer than 20% of the then existing civil service employees. Although Jackson was not the inaugural advocate of the spoils system, his endorsement and implementation thereof significantly influenced American politics during the periods known as the second and third party systems, which persisted until the 1890s. One historian remarked that Jackson might not have dismissed as many government workers as was believed at the time, and he might not have been the founder of the spoils system, yet he effected more substantial modifications to the federal bureaucracy than any of his predecessors. It is crucial to recognize that Jackson and his proponents perceived these actions not simply as a means to reward allies and punish adversaries, but as an authentic reform. They contended that rotating public office served to eliminate corrupt officials from minority political factions, portraying it as a refinement to the system, rather than a hindrance to effective governance. This viewpoint provides a meaningful understanding of how political practices and beliefs evolve over time, accentuating the intricacy of historical figures like Jackson and their enduring impacts. The Whigs and Democrats, despite sharing a common ancestor, had significant agreements on the basic principles of republicanism in the United States. Generally, the Whigs were more affluent, better educated, more urban, and entrepreneurial, while the Democrats were more dominant in frontier and subsistence farming areas. Catholics, particularly the Irish and Germans, were avid supporters of the Democrats, whereas evangelical Protestants and immigrants from England and Scotland-Ireland tended to support the Whigs. Norton highlights that despite these commonalities, there were critical policy differences between the two. The Whigs leaned toward stimulating economic growth via an active role of the government, whereas Democrats favored minimal central government interference. While Whigs supported initiatives like corporate charters, a national bank, and paper currency, Democrats were against these measures. Whigs were also more inclined towards humanitarian reforms such as public schools, elimination of capital punishment, prison and asylum improvements, and temperance. Whigs were generally more optimistic and willing to assist specific groups if it benefited the greater good, believing corporate charters expanded economic opportunities for all. In contrast, Democrats, wary of concentrated economic power and coercion, staunchly followed the Jeffersonian ideal of a limited government. The formation of the Whig Party was a response to those discontent with Andrew Jackson's handling of the nullification crisis, including economic modernizers, bankers, businessmen, commercial farmers, Southern planters, and those opposed to Jackson's approach. This new party likened its fight against Jackson, whom they dubbed King Andrew, to the 1776 Whigs' fight against King George III. In the Northeast, the Anti-Masons, a group opposed to the secretive Masonic order, eventually merged with the Whigs. Jackson countered by leveraging federal patronage, forming alliances with local leaders and positioning the bank and its allies as threats to Republican ideals, leading his followers to embrace the Democrats' title. The Whigs proposed a robust program for economic modernization, including high tariffs to encourage domestic manufacturing, which Democrats criticized as beneficial only for the wealthy and advocated for tariffs solely for revenue. The Whigs believed in the necessity of banks and paper currency, which Democrats refuted, and public works projects to enhance the nation's infrastructure for economic development. Meanwhile, Democrats preferred traditional farming and expansion initiatives, conquering territories like Florida, Texas, the Southwest, California, and Oregon, and showing interest in Cuba, under the leadership of figures like Jackson and Polk. In urban settings, the wealthier classes predominantly supported the Whigs, with a significant percentage of the wealthiest individuals in cities like Boston and New York City voting Whig. In contrast, in rural America, Whigs had more support in commercial areas and market towns, whereas Democrats were more popular on the frontier and in isolated regions. Ethnic and religious affiliations often dictated political alignments, with Irish and German Catholics leaning Democratic and pietistic Protestants more likely to be Whigs. Ginop in 1982 highlights a significant transformation in the American political landscape after 1820, which is often linked to the era known as Jacksonian democracy. Interestingly, although Andrew Jackson, who became president in 1828, didn't start these changes, he embodied many of them and leveraged them to his advantage. For the first time, politics took on a major role in the daily lives of voters. Before this shift, local politics was mostly marked by a passive attitude from the general public and a deference to the upper class. It wasn't that voting laws were too restrictive for white men. Rather, most simply weren't that interested in politics, and even fewer actively participated because politics didn't seem relevant to their lives. This trend began to change following the economic upheaval of the Panic of 1819 and gained momentum with Jackson's election in 1828. Jackson, with his dynamic personality and polarizing policies, drew attention and sparked engagement. By the time 1840 rolled around, the transformation was complete. Ginop describes the period by saying, "With the full establishment of the second-party system, campaigns were characterized by appeals to the common man, mass meetings, parades, celebrations, and intense enthusiasm, while elections generated high voter participation. In structure and ideology, American politics had been democratized." In other words, American politics had become truly democratic, with vibrant campaigns and high levels of voter turnout, a stark contrast to the political apathy of previous decades. Both sides leaned heavily into their networks of national newspapers. Many editors were not just news purveyors, they were major political influencers in their regions. They stuffed their publications with everything a politically minded reader might want, from details about rallies and speeches to the full texts of key speeches and the policies the candidates stood on. Now, when we talk about how firm each party stood, the Whigs had it pretty together in most states, except on the frontier. They had their stronghold in the Northeast, particularly appealing to business folks, merchants, commercial farmers, and professionals. The Whigs knew how to harness the power of the press and engaged in captivating campaign strategies that drove an impressive 75 to 85% of eligible voters to the polls. Abraham Lincoln was a standout figure in Illinois for the Whigs, often going head-to-head with Stephen Douglas, a remarkably skilled politician from the Democrats' side. While the Democrats might have trailed a bit in the newspaper arena, they compensated with a tight grip on party loyalty. At Democratic conventions, from the lowest local levels to the grand national gatherings, if you showed up, you were expected to back whoever was chosen as the candidate, no matter your personal feelings. This approach led to its share of internal conflicts, but overall the Democrats had a knack for rallying their base and getting their members to fall in line more effectively than the Whigs. One of the significant issues the Whig Party faced was its indecision on the stance regarding slavery. The party consisted of a mix of Northern National Republicans and Southern Nullifiers, and these factions had vastly different views on the subject of slavery. This divergence meant that the Whigs could only maintain successful political campaigns by completely sidestepping the topic of slavery. However, by the early 1850s, ignoring the slavery issue was no longer an option. It had become the central topic of the day, and the Whigs found themselves unable to find a unified stance on it. This disagreement resulted in the beginning of the party's disintegration. A minority of Whigs held on to the belief that, faced with the alternatives of a pro-Northern Republican Party and a pro-Southern Democratic Party, they represented the last hope for keeping the United States united. In 1856, the remaining Whigs supported Millard Fillmore from the Know Nothing campaign, and by 1860, they endorsed John Bell from the Constitutional Union ticket. However, the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 spelled the end for the Whig Party. Interestingly, in most towns and cities, prominent individuals and those in control of local offices, judicial positions, and numerous state offices were Whigs. This status gave them considerable influence, albeit to varying degrees. For instance, Springfield, Illinois was recognized as a stronghold for Whigs, prominently standing out in a Democrat-dominated region. Records indicate that the visible presence of Whigs in Springfield began in 1836 during the opposition to Martin Van Buren's presidential campaign and intensified in 1840. The majority of Whigs in Springfield were either from New England or Kentucky and were typically professionals or farm owners who strongly believed in party unity. Abraham Lincoln's entry and progress in politics exemplify the manner in which the Whigs amassed influence. Yet by the 1840s, as a growing number of immigrants arrived in Springfield, the Democrats started to prevail. By the time the 1860 presidential election took place, Lincoln narrowly secured victory in Springfield. By the 1850s, the leaders of the Democratic Party had started to embrace a lot of the ideas previously championed by the Whigs, and it was clear to everyone that the nation was rapidly modernizing with the growth of factories and railroads. The economic debates that had dominated politics were fading away, particularly as influential figures like Calhoun, Webster, Clay, Jackson, and Polk were no longer around. New issues, particularly those concerning slavery, immigration, and religion, became the main focus. The year 1848 marked the final stand for the Whigs. It was widely understood that their only chance of victory was if the Democrats were divided. After the Free Soil Revolt was resolved after 1852, the Democrats seemed unbeatable. The Whigs tried to keep going, but gradually, both their regular supporters and their leaders began to leave the party. This set the stage for the emergence of the third-party system. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more content.